Rain pounded on my head like tiny hammers, each droplet a reminder of how spectacularly I'd screwed up my life. I huddled deeper into the doorway, my notebook getting damp despite my best efforts. Little Rock in autumn wasn't supposed to be this damn cold. Just one more stanza, I muttered, pen scratching against the soggy paper. Poetry doesn't pay bills, but it kept me sane while everything else went to hell. The neon sign across the street blinked through the downpour Beatrice's beans with a coffee cup that winked on and off. My stomach growled, reminding me it had been nearly 20 hours since my last meal. The $5 in my pocket could buy either dinner or shelter tonight, not both. I gathered my few possessions notebook, pen, backpack containing everything I owned, and made a mad dash across the flooded street. The bell above the door announced my dripping arrival to the cozy shop. The scent of espresso and cinnamon hit me like a warm embrace. "Be right with you," called a voice from somewhere behind the counter. I stood there dripping, suddenly self-conscious about my appearance. My blonde hair hung in wet ropes around my face, and my once decent jacket was now a sodden mess. I probably looked like a drowned rat. "Sorry about the wait," said the woman emerging from the back room. "Oh, you're soaked." She wasn't what I expected. Most baristas in this town were college students, but she was my age, maybe a few years older. Dark brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, striking blue eyes that widened with concern, and the kind of smile that made you want to spill all your secrets. "I've got towels," she said, already reaching beneath the counter. "Hurricane out there, huh?" "Thanks," I managed, accepting the clean white towel and dabbing at my face. "Just a small coffee, please. Whatever's cheapest." She raised an eyebrow but turned to the machines. I settled at a table by the window, pulling out my notebook again. The coffee shop was nearly empty except for a businessman in the corner, tapping intently on his laptop. When she brought my coffee, I noticed her name tag, Beatrice, the owner herself. "On the house," she said, setting it down. "And I can pay," I protested weakly. "Nah, consider it my good deed for the day." She glanced at my notebook. "You a student?" "Poet," I said, immediately regretting how pretentious it sounded. "I mean, I try to be. Can I hear some?" The question caught me off guard. People didn't usually ask to hear my work, but something about her interested expression made me nod. I cleared my throat and began reading a piece about urban loneliness. Halfway through, I noticed the businessman glance up with irritation before returning to his screen with a huff. Beatrice noticed too. When I finished, she applauded softly. "That was beautiful, really. What's your name?" "Kira. Kira Powell." "Well, Kira Powell, I'd love to hear more sometime. Feel free to stay until closing. It's warm, and we've got outlets if you need to charge anything." Our fingers brushed as she slid a small plate with a blueberry scone toward me. A jolt of something unexpected passed between us, something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. "Thank you," I whispered, suddenly unable to meet those blue eyes. She smiled again before walking away, leaving me with the feeling that something important had just happened. I couldn't have known then how right I was. I returned the next day, and the day after that. Each time, Beatrice greeted me with that same warm smile, occasionally sliding free pastries my way when business was slow. We talked about poetry, about coffee, about the changing colors of the leaves in the park where I pretended not to sleep. On the third day, as she was closing up shop, she caught me lingering, reluctant to face another night outdoors. "Kira," she said softly, "do you have somewhere to go tonight?" And just like that, my carefully constructed facade crumbled. Sometimes a simple question can change everything. "I'm fine," I lied, the words automatic after months of practice. "Just working on some new material." Beatrice's eyes, those perceptive blue pools, saw right through me. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You sleep in the park, don't you? I've seen your backpack hidden under that big oak near the fountain." My face burned with shame as I looked away. This was exactly why I'd avoided making connections the inevitable moment when people discovered I was homeless, when pity replaced whatever respect they might have had. "It's temporary," I said, gathering my things. "I've got some opportunities coming up." "It's going to freeze tonight," she replied simply. "First frost warning of the season." I hadn't known that. My phone service had been cut off weeks ago, weather forecasts a luxury I couldn't afford. The prospect of sub-freezing temperatures sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "I've got a spare room," Beatrice continued, locking the coffee shop door behind us. Just until you figure things out. I stared at her, searching for the catch. Why would you help me? You barely know me. In your poem yesterday, about the woman who feeds pigeons because they're the only creatures who need her, it made me cry in the storeroom. She smiled sheepishly. Anyone who can write like that deserves a warm bed. We walked 3 blocks to her apartment above a bookstore. Every step felt surreal, like I was floating through someone else's life. Her place was exactly what I would have imagined: walls lined with bookshelves, mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, plants thriving on every windowsill. It smelled like cinnamon and old books. Bathroom's down the hall, she said, showing me to a small but cozy room. Shower has great water pressure, towels in the cabinet. I hadn't had a hot shower in weeks. The prospect nearly brought me to tears. This is just temporary, I insisted, needing her to know I wasn't some charity case. A few days until the weather improves. I can help around the shop to pay you back. We can figure that out tomorrow, she said, and left me to shower in peace. Under the hot water, I finally let myself cry, silent tears mixing with the spray. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of basic human comforts: warmth, safety, kindness. Later, wrapped in borrowed pajamas that smelled like lavender detergent, I found Beatrice in the kitchen heating milk on the stove. Hot chocolate, she explained. My mom's recipe. Secret ingredient is cayenne pepper. We sat at her kitchen counter, steam rising from our mugs, and it struck me how intimate this felt despite knowing her for such a short time. What happened? She asked finally. If you don't mind me asking. So I told her. About the teaching job I'd lost when the community college cut their arts program. About the roommate who'd moved out suddenly, leaving me with rent I couldn't afford. About selling everything except what fit in my backpack. About how quickly a normal life could unravel. Poetry doesn't exactly pay the bills, I concluded with a bitter laugh. Neither does running an independent coffee shop, she countered. But we do what we love anyway. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in months, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I'd gotten here. Pride had kept me from asking for help, from admitting defeat. Yet somehow, this stranger had seen through all my defenses. Days turned into a week. I helped open the shop each morning, learning the rhythm of the espresso machine and memorizing regular customers' orders. Beatrice taught me how to make leaf designs in the foam. You're a natural, she said one morning as I presented a perfect Rosetta pattern. Our fingers brushed as I handed her the cup, and there it was again, that strange electric current between us. Her eyes met mine, held for a beat too long before she turned away. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted Little Rock, we sat on her couch watching old movies. Somewhere between Casablanca and His Girl Friday, her hand found mine in the darkness. You know, she said softly, the spare room is yours for as long as you need it. I turned to her, our faces close in the blue glow of the television. For a moment, I thought she might lean closer. Instead, she squeezed my hand gently and turned back to the movie. But something had shifted between us, something neither of us was ready to name. As I fell asleep that night, I realized I hadn't written a poem about loneliness in days. Instead, my notebook was filling with verses about blue eyes and the taste of cinnamon. Ever been horseback riding? Beatrice asked one Saturday morning as we prepared to open the shop. The question came out of nowhere, startling me from my focus on grinding beans. Me? No, I laughed. Poetry and horseback riding don't exactly go hand in hand. She flipped the sign to open and turned to me with a mischievous smile. My friend Ross has a ranch about 20 minutes outside town. I go most weekends to clear my head. You should come with me tomorrow. I don't know. The thought of large animals I couldn't control made me nervous. Plus, there was something intimate about being invited into another piece of her life. You've been cooped up in the apartment or the shop for weeks. Fresh air would do you good. She bumped her hip against mine playfully. Don't worry, we'll start you on the gentlest mare in Arkansas. That's how I found myself the next morning in borrowed jeans and boots that were slightly too big, staring up at a chestnut horse named Maple who seemed far larger up close than horses appeared in movies. She's enormous, I whispered as Beatrice adjusted the saddle straps with practiced ease. She's a sweetheart, Beatrice corrected, patting the horse's neck. Aren't you, girl? The ranch sprawled across rolling hills, morning mist still clinging to the distant tree line. It was peaceful in a way the city never managed to be, the air crisp with approaching winter. I'll go first, show you how it's done, Beatrice said, mounting her own horse, a sleek black stallion named Thunder, with graceful confidence. I'd seen different sides of her these past weeks, the businesswoman opening her shop at dawn, the compassionate friend offering shelter, the relaxed roommate laughing at bad TV. But this version of Beatrice was something else entirely. She sat tall in the saddle, back straight, handling the powerful animal beneath her with subtle commands. Her hair was braided down her back, catching morning sunlight as she guided Thunder in a wide circle around the paddock. There was something wild and free about her, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "See? Nothing to it," she called, bringing Thunder to a stop beside me. "Your turn." With Ross holding Maple steady, I awkwardly hoisted myself into the saddle, feeling precarious and ungainly compared to Beatrice's natural grace. "Back straight," she instructed, dismounting to help me. "Heels down, reins like this." Her hands covered mine, adjusting my grip. "Feel how she responds to the slightest pressure?" I nodded, too aware of her body close to mine, her breath warm against my cheek as she leaned in to demonstrate. Maple shifted beneath me, and I clutched the saddle horn in panic. "I've got you," Beatrice said, placing her hands firmly on my waist to steady me. "Trust the horse, trust yourself." Her hands lingered longer than necessary, and when I glanced down, our eyes met. Something unspoken passed between us before she stepped back and swung herself onto Thunder again. "And let's take them around the paddock once, nice and slow," she suggested, her voice slightly huskier than before. For an hour, she patiently taught me the basics, how to signal Maple to walk, turn, and stop. By the end, my legs ached and my hands were cramped from nervously gripping the reins, but I'd managed not to fall off. "Not bad for a first-timer," she said as Ross helped me dismount. "Give it a few more sessions and you'll be galloping through those fields." "Don't count on it," I laughed, legs wobbling as I readjusted to solid ground. But secretly, I was already looking forward to trying again. After returning the horses to the stable, Beatrice led me to a creek that cut through the property. We perched on large rocks, eating the sandwiches she'd packed that morning. "How long have you been riding?" I asked. "Since I was 8. My grandfather had horses." She smiled at some private memory. "When things get complicated, this is where I come to sort myself out." "And are things complicated now?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. She looked at me for a long moment. They might be getting there. Later, as we drove back to town, the radio playing softly between us, I found myself writing mental poetry about the curve of her neck as she concentrated on the road, about the strength in her hands as she'd controlled her horse, about the way sunlight had danced in her dark hair. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching me staring. "Just processing today. Trying to find the right words to describe it." "And? Any luck?" I smiled, looking out the window at the passing landscape. "Still working on it. Some experiences defy easy description." Back at the apartment, she headed straight for the shower while I collapsed on the couch, muscles aching in places I didn't know could ache. I closed my eyes, replaying the image of her on horseback, confident, powerful, beautiful. When she emerged in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, hair damp around her shoulders, she brought 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me. "So, poet," she said with a gentle smile, "has today inspired any verses?" "Maybe," I admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to share them just yet." Her eyes held mine, searching. "When you are, I'd love to hear them." Something was shifting between us, something neither of us had put into words. As she reached for the remote to turn on a movie, her fingertips brushed my arm, the lightest touch, yet I felt it like a brand against my skin. A week after our horseback riding adventure, the lights went out across 3 blocks of downtown Little Rock. The autumn storm that had been threatening all day finally unleashed its fury, lightning cracking across the sky as rain lashed against the windows. "Perfect timing," Beatrice sighed, rummaging through kitchen drawers by the light of her phone. "Ah, here we go." She emerged triumphant with candles and matches, soon bathing the apartment in a warm golden glow. Outside the wind howled, but inside our little bubble, everything felt oddly intimate and timeless. "And I think this calls for wine," she declared, producing a bottle of Cabernet from a cabinet. "Power outages have certain traditions after all." I watched her pour 2 glasses, mesmerized by how the candlelight played across her features, softening the angles of her face and turning her blue eyes almost midnight dark. "2 unexpected storms," she said, raising her glass to mine with a gentle clink. 2 hours and half a bottle later, we'd migrated to the floor, backs against the couch, sharing stories that seemed easier to tell in the forgiving darkness. Beatrice told me about her ex-fiancé, who'd left her for a yoga instructor 6 months before their wedding. I kept the coffee shop in the breakup. He wanted to sell it, but I fought for it. Sometimes I think I loved that place more than I ever loved him. She swirled the wine in her glass thoughtfully. Looking back, our relationship never felt, complete? I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. My last relationship was with this literature professor. Everyone thought we were perfect together, both writers, both passionate about the same books. I took another sip of wine, but something was always missing. Like we were playing roles in someone else's story. "What do you think was missing?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. I stared into the candle flame, searching for words. Electricity. That feeling when you're with someone, and your skin feels more alive than it's ever been. I paused, suddenly self-conscious. That probably sounds ridiculous. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." The conversation flowed as easily as the wine, moving from past relationships to childhood dreams, to the books that had shaped us. At some point, Beatrice pulled a blanket from the couch, draping it over both our laps as the apartment grew cooler without heat. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, refilling our glasses with the last of the wine. "After everything I've told you tonight, ask away. Have you ever been with a woman?" The question hung in the air between us, my heart suddenly pounding against my ribs. "No," I admitted. "Have you?" She shook her head. "I've thought about it, though. Sometimes I wonder if that's why nothing has ever felt quite right." Something shifted in the room, an almost tangible change in the atmosphere between us. Her confession hung in the air, neither of us knowing quite how to proceed. To break the tension, I told her about the time I'd tried to impress a date by cooking a fancy French meal, only to set off the fire alarm in my building. She countered with the story of showing up to a blind date at the wrong restaurant and accidentally joining a stranger's anniversary dinner. We laughed until tears came, the heavy moment passing even as something of it lingered in the air around us. As the night grew later, our voices grew softer, our bodies gradually shifting closer beneath the shared blanket. The wine and candlelight and storm created a world that felt removed from reality, a space where confessions seemed natural and consequences distant. "I'm glad you came into my coffee shop that day," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. Even though I was just a dripping mess looking for shelter? Especially because of that. Her smile in the candlelight made my breath catch. Sometimes the best things come into our lives disguised as disasters. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to early morning light filtering through the windows. The power had returned sometime during the night, evidenced by the blinking clocks on the microwave and cable box. What I noticed next made my heart skip. Beatrice's arm draped protectively around my waist, her body curved against mine as we lay side by side on the floor. Her breathing was deep and even, still lost in sleep. I remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had been cast over us. In sleep, her face was peaceful, dark lashes fanned against her cheeks, lips slightly parted. My mind flashed back to our conversation about missing electricity, about wondering why past relationships had never felt right. As I lay there, acutely aware of every point where her body touched mine, I finally understood what had been missing all along. When her eyes eventually fluttered open, meeting mine with momentary confusion before warming with recognition, I knew something fundamental had changed between us. Neither of us mentioned our sleeping arrangement as we stretched and rose, moving around each other with a new awareness, stealing glances when we thought the other wasn't looking. But beneath the morning light, the question that had emerged in the candlelit darkness remained unspoken. What happens now? 3 weeks after the power outage, things between Beatrice and me had settled into a strange limbo. We continued our comfortable routines, opening the shop together, sharing meals, watching movies, but an undercurrent of tension thrummed beneath every interaction, neither of us brave enough to acknowledge what had happened that night. My savings had grown just enough that I could have afforded a room in a shared apartment, but neither of us mentioned me moving out. The spare room had become mine in small ways, my books on the nightstand, my clothes in the closet, my favorite mug permanently stationed in the kitchen cabinet. "I need to find work," I told her one morning as we prepared the shop for opening. "Real work, I mean. I can't keep helping around the shop without actual pay. It's not fair to you." "You've been bringing in customers with the poetry nights," she protested. "That's worth something." She was right about that. The weekly poetry readings I'd organized had doubled our Thursday night business. But it wasn't a real job, and we both knew it. Still, I insisted. I need something steady, something that pays. That afternoon, I scanned job listings while manning the counter during Beatrice's supply run. Nothing promising appeared until I overheard two women chatting at a corner table about staff shortages at the Velvet Room. "Excuse me," I interrupted during a lull. I couldn't help overhearing, "Is the Velvet Room hiring?" The older woman with cropped silver hair nodded. "Desperately. One bartender quit without notice last week." "You have experience?" I lied smoothly, claiming 2 years behind the bar at a place that had closed down. In reality, I'd mixed drinks at exactly 3 college parties. But how hard could it be? "Great," she said, sliding a business card across the table. "Ask for Marion. Tell her Judith sent you." That night, I showed Beatrice the card over dinner. "It's just bartending. Evenings only, so I can still help open the shop." "The Velvet Room?" Her eyebrows rose. "Do you know what kind of place that is?" I shrugged. "A bar, right? The pay's supposed to be good, and they need someone immediately." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "It's a women's bar, Kira. As in, primarily lesbian clientele." "Oh." My cheeks flushed hot. "Well, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that." "I didn't think you would." Her eyes held mine with an unreadable expression. Given our conversation during the blackout, my heart hammered as she referenced that night for the first time. Right, that. The moment stretched between us until she looked away. "The tips should be good. Just be prepared for some attention." Marion hired me on the spot the next evening, giving me a crash course on their drink menu before throwing me into the Friday night rush. I mixed Cosmos and margaritas with increasing confidence, grateful that most patrons were patient with my novice fumbling. By my third shift, I'd developed a rhythm, even managing light banter with the regulars who seemed charmed by my poetic descriptions of the specialty cocktails. I noticed women slipping me their numbers alongside tips, but politely declined any outright invitations. My fourth night, a woman with perfect makeup and predatory eyes planted herself at my section of the bar. She ordered complicated drinks, each time leaning farther over the counter, her intentions crystal clear. "I get off at 2, she purred after her third Manhattan. "How about you?" "I'm just here to work," I replied with a practiced smile. "But I appreciate the offer." She frowned, clearly unused to rejection. "Playing hard to get is cute and all, but—" She said no, came a familiar voice to my left. I whirled to find Beatrice perched on a bar stool, looking stunning in a fitted black dress I'd never seen before. My mouth went dry at the sight of her, casual elegance radiating from every inch. "I didn't know you were coming tonight," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thought I'd surprise you." Her eyes flickered to my persistent admirer, who was now retreating with a huff. "Looks like I had good timing." I mixed her favorite gin and tonic, sliding it across with a smile. "My knight in shining armor." She laughed, the sound somehow carrying over the pulsing music. "Just looking out for my roommate." The word roommate felt inadequate now, but I didn't know what other word to substitute. The night progressed smoothly until just before closing, when 3 men burst through the door. I didn't immediately register the situation as dangerous men occasionally wandered in by mistake until I saw the masks covering their faces and the glint of metal in their hands. "Everyone stay calm," the tallest one shouted. "This is a robbery. Phones and wallets on the bar now." Panic rippled through the room. I froze, the cocktail shaker slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. The sound drew the attention of the nearest robber, who swung toward me, pointing what I now clearly recognized as a gun. "Empty the register, Blondie. Now." My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. Across the room, women were placing valuables on tables, some crying quietly. The third robber was getting agitated, shouting at someone who wasn't complying fast enough. Then I saw Beatrice stand up slowly, hands raised in a calming gesture. My heart stopped as she took a deliberate step toward the leader. "You gentlemen seem stressed," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "Which makes sense. This situation's gotten out of hand quickly, hasn't it?" The man swung his weapon toward her. "Sit down, lady." "And just talking," she continued, maintaining perfect eye contact despite the gun. She probably didn't expect such a crowd on a Tuesday. That complicates things. I watched in horror and astonishment as she continued speaking, her tone conversational yet authoritative. Something in her demeanor commanded attention. The robbers actually seemed to be listening. Police response time in this district is about 4 minutes, she informed them calmly. You've been here for 2. Those sirens in the distance, that's your window closing. As if on cue, distant wailing became audible. The 3 men exchanged panicked glances. Take what you've collected and go, Beatrice advised. No one's been hurt yet. Keep it that way. Incredibly, they did exactly that, grabbing the bags of collected valuables and fleeing out the back exit. The moment they disappeared, the room erupted in chaos, people crying, hugging, some rushing for the doors. I vaulted over the bar and ran straight to Beatrice, who now sat heavily on her stool, the composed facade crumbling as adrenaline gave way to tremors. Are you insane? I whispered fiercely, gripping her shoulders. They could have killed you! She looked up at me, blue eyes wide with lingering fear. I couldn't let them hurt you. And in that moment, surrounded by panic and police sirens, I realized just how deeply I had fallen for her. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and shocked patrons. Officers swarmed the Velvet Room, taking statements from everyone while searching for evidence the robbers might have left behind. Ma'am, what made you approach armed suspects? A detective asked Beatrice. As we sat side by side, emergency blankets draped over our shoulders despite the lack of physical injury. De-escalation training, she replied, her voice steady though her hands still trembled slightly in her lap. I worked as a crisis negotiator before opening my coffee shop. I turned to her, stunned. You were what? She gave me a small smile. 4 years with the Memphis PD's crisis team. I was going to tell you eventually. The detective nodded appreciatively. Well, your training probably saved lives tonight. Still, I wouldn't recommend civilians confronting armed robbers as standard practice. After what felt like hours, we were finally cleared to leave. Dawn was breaking as we walked to her car, exhaustion settling into our bones. Neither of us spoke during the drive home, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. Inside the apartment, Beatrice headed straight for the kitchen and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring 2 generous glasses. To surviving, she said, handing me one. I accepted it but didn't drink. Why didn't you tell me about your past job? She shrugged, leaning against the counter. It doesn't define me anymore. I left that life behind for a reason. She took a sip, wincing at the burn. Too many situations where words weren't enough. Too many failures I couldn't forget. What you did tonight wasn't a failure, I insisted. You were incredible. I was terrified, she admitted quietly. Not for myself, but when I saw that gun pointed at you. She shook her head, unable to finish. Something broke open inside me at her words. The fear, the adrenaline, the realization of what could have been lost, it all crashed together into a single overwhelming impulse. I crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, took her face in my hands, and finally did what I'd been thinking about for weeks. I kissed her. For one terrible second, she froze, and I thought I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then her glass clinked against the counter as she set it down to wrap her arms around my waist, pulling me closer as she responded with equal fervor. Everything we'd left unsaid poured into that kiss, the tension of the night, the weeks of wondering, the electricity that had been building between us since that first rainy day in the coffee shop. Her lips were soft but insistent against mine, tasting of whiskey and possibility. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, she leaned her forehead against mine. I've been wanting to do that since I watched you read poetry that first day, she whispered. Why didn't you? I was afraid. Of scaring you away, of misreading everything. I laughed softly. We've been such idiots. Complete idiots, she agreed, capturing my lips again. We moved from the kitchen to the living room, falling onto the couch in a tangle of limbs and desperate touches. The fear and adrenaline transformed into something urgent and vital, hands exploring unfamiliar territory with reverent curiosity. Her fingers traced my collarbone, dipped lower across my chest, each touch igniting new sensations I'd never experienced before. I marveled at the softness of her skin as I pushed her dress off her shoulders, at the way she arched into my touch. Are you sure about this? She whispered against my neck, her breath hot against my skin. I've never been more certain of anything. I answered, guiding her hand to the buttons of my shirt. What followed was a revelation: the difference between going through motions I'd been taught to expect and truly discovering desire for the first time. Her body against mine felt right in a way nothing ever had before, each caress answering questions I hadn't known to ask. We moved to her bedroom as dawn light filtered through the curtains, casting everything in golden hues. There, without the urgent fear that had fueled our initial encounter, we took time to learn each other properly. What made her gasp, what made me shiver, the rhythm that built between us like poetry. Hours later, as morning fully claimed the day, we lay wrapped in each other's arms, my head resting on her chest, listening to her heartbeat slowly return to normal. I never knew it could feel like that, I admitted quietly. Her fingers combed gently through my hair. Neither did I. Sleep claimed us eventually, our exhausted bodies surrendering after the night's emotional and physical marathon. When I woke sometime in the afternoon, panic briefly fluttered in my chest. What had we done? Would this ruin everything between us? I slipped out of bed, pulling on a t-shirt and underwear before padding to the kitchen, my mind racing with possibilities. Had it just been the adrenaline? Would she regret it in the light of day? I was filling the coffee maker when warm arms wrapped around me from behind, lips pressing gently against my shoulder. I could hear you overthinking from the bedroom, Beatrice murmured against my skin. I turned in her arms, searching her face for any sign of regret. What I found instead was a tender smile and clear eyes that held none of the doubt plaguing me. Good morning, she said, reaching past me to grab 2 mugs from the cabinet. Or afternoon, I suppose. About last night, I began. She placed a finger against my lips. If you're about to apologize, don't. Unless... Her confidence faltered slightly. Unless you regret it? No, I said quickly. Not at all. I just wasn't sure if you might think it was a mistake. She laughed, relief evident in the sound. Kira Powell, that was possibly the least mistaken thing I've ever done. She handed me a steaming mug of coffee and leaned in to kiss me softly, the simple domesticity of the moment somehow more intimate than everything that had transpired hours before. So, what happens now? I asked when we broke apart. Now, she said with a smile that warmed me more than the coffee ever could. We figure it out together. The morning after everything changed between us, I woke up in Beatrice's bed for the second time, but found myself alone. Panic flared briefly until I heard cabinet doors opening and closing in the kitchen. I pulled on a robe and padded out to find her making breakfast, humming softly to herself. Hey, she said, turning with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. I was going to surprise you with breakfast in bed. I should have felt at ease. The night had been everything I hadn't known I wanted. Beatrice everything I hadn't realized I needed. But as I watched her move around the kitchen, an unexpected anxiety coiled in my chest. I need some air, I blurted out. And to write. My head's full. Concern flickered across her face. Everything okay? Yes, no, I don't know. I ran a hand through my tangled hair. I just need to process. Understanding softened her expression. Of course, take whatever time you need. An hour later, I was sitting cross-legged on a park bench, my notebook open on my lap. The same park where I'd slept not so long ago, now served as my refuge for a different reason. Words poured out of me, messy and raw, about desire I hadn't recognized, about the terrifying vulnerability of wanting someone this much, about the fear of losing the safe harbor Beatrice had become. The poetry was different from anything I'd written before. Instead of observing loneliness from within its embrace, I wrote about the terror of potentially losing connection. The verses were unpolished, almost frantic, filling page after page as autumn leaves drifted down around me. I lost track of time until the sky darkened and a light rain began to fall. 2 days had somehow slipped past, with me returning to the apartment only for brief moments when I knew Beatrice would be at the coffee shop. I'd left notes working on something important, or needed space to think, but nothing substantial enough to explain my sudden distance. On the 3rd day, as I huddled under a gazebo, watching the increasingly heavy rainfall, a familiar figure appeared on the path, umbrella in hand, determination in her stride. You're avoiding me, Beatrice said without preamble, closing her umbrella as she stepped under the shelter. I'm writing, I corrected, gesturing to my ink-stained fingers and notebook. For 3 days, without a proper conversation. She sat beside me on the bench, maintaining a careful distance. Did I do something wrong? Was it too much? Too fast? The genuine worry in her voice broke through my self-imposed isolation. No, you were perfect. That's the problem. Her brow furrowed. You're going to have to explain that one to me. I closed my notebook, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. I've never felt this way before, about anyone, man or woman. I swallowed hard. It scares me how much I want this. How much I want you. And that made you run away? I didn't run away. At her skeptical look, I amended, okay, maybe I did. But not because I don't want this. Because I do, so much that it terrifies me. Rain pattered on the gazebo roof, creating a cocoon of white noise around us. What are you afraid of, exactly? She asked softly. That this is just an experiment for one of us. That I'll mess it up. That you'll realize I'm still the homeless poet you took pity on. I took a shaky breath. That I'll lose you and the coffee shop and this new life all at once. She reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. First, I never pitied you. I admired you from day one. Her thumb traced patterns on my skin. Second, this isn't an experiment for me. I've been thinking about us for months. Really? Why do you think I invited a complete stranger to live with me? I told myself it was compassion, but deep down, I didn't want you to leave. She smiled wryly. Not my most logical decision. But what if... Kira, she interrupted gently. Soon we could spend forever on what ifs. What if we try and it falls apart? Sure. But what if it doesn't? What if this is exactly where we're both supposed to be? A particularly strong gust of wind blew rain into the gazebo, speckling her hair with droplets that caught the fading light like tiny stars. I've spent my whole life playing it safe, she continued. Opening the coffee shop was the biggest risk I'd ever taken until I met you. And now? She squeezed my hand. Now I want to risk more. The sincerity in her eyes undid me completely. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against hers. And I want that too, I whispered. I'm just not used to getting what I want. Well, get used to it, she replied, closing the distance between us with a kiss that tasted of rain and promise. We stayed in the gazebo as darkness fell completely, trading kisses and truths as the storm intensified around us. I read her fragments of what I'd written, no longer afraid to share the depth of my feelings. She listened with such open attention that each word felt like a gift rather than an exposure. So, she said eventually, are you coming home? Or do you need more time with your notebook? Home. The word resonated through me. Not her apartment, our home. Let's go home, I agreed, gathering my things. The rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle by the time we stepped out from under the shelter. Beatrice opened her umbrella, holding it over both of us as we walked arm in arm through the glistening park. Just so we're clear, she said, as we approached the apartment building, this isn't temporary for me. You and me, I'm all in if you are. Under the yellow glow of a street lamp, with raindrops sparkling around us like we'd stepped into some magical realm, I made my choice. I'm all in, I said, the words feeling like a vow, completely, terrifyingly all in. Her smile outshone the street lamp as she drew me close for another kiss, right there on the rain-slicked sidewalk, neither of us caring who might see. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The weeks following our rain-soaked reconciliation in the park were the happiest of my life. Beatrice and I fell into a rhythm that felt both thrilling and comfortable, as if we'd found something that had been waiting for us all along. Our days began with shared coffee and stolen kisses before opening the shop, and ended with long conversations tangled in her sheets. When Beatrice suggested hosting a poetry night at the coffee shop, I initially hesitated. We already have decent evening business, I pointed out. Why change things? Because you're talented, and more people should hear your work, she said simply. Plus, it would bring in a different crowd on Thursdays. We could make it a weekly thing. So Thursday night became poetry night at Beatrice's Beans. The first week, only 8 people showed up, mostly regulars curious about the change in routine. I read 3 poems, careful to choose ones that didn't too obviously reveal they were about the woman making lattes behind the counter. By the 3rd week, we had standing room only, and by the 5th, Beatrice had to start taking reservations. Something about the intimate atmosphere, the quality of the coffee, and perhaps even my poetry had struck a chord in Little Rock's artistic community. We should feature other poets too, I suggested as we closed up after a particularly successful night. There's so much talent coming through those doors. Beatrice agreed enthusiastically, and soon Thursday nights became a local institution, a place where established poets and nervous first-timers alike could share their work with an appreciative audience. As the featured poet for the 8th consecutive week, I had prepared something special, a series of interconnected poems tracing my journey from homelessness to home, careful to maintain some artistic distance while still honoring the truth of my experience. The coffee shop was packed as usual, the lights dimmed to create the perfect ambiance. Beatrice introduced me with obvious pride in her voice, her eyes meeting mine with such open affection that several audience members exchanged knowing smiles. "Tonight," I began, settling on the stool in the small performance area, "I'd like to share some new work. It's called Shelter from the Storm." The pieces were more personal than anything I'd read before, charting the progression from taking refuge from rain to finding refuge in another person's arms. Though I never explicitly mentioned Beatrice, anyone listening carefully could hear the thread of our story woven through the verses. When I finished the final poem, there was a moment of complete silence before thunderous applause erupted. I glanced at Beatrice behind the counter, finding her hastily wiping tears from her cheeks. During the intermission, as other poets prepared to take the stage, a man approached me at the counter where I was helping Beatrice with the rush of orders. "Kira Powell, right?" His tone was friendly enough, but something in his stance put me immediately on edge. "Great stuff up there. Very revealing." "Thanks," I said noncommittally, continuing to prepare drinks. "And Derek, I used to date Beatrice." He extended his hand, which I reluctantly shook. Didn't realize she'd moved on to experimenting with girls now. Beatrice tensed beside me, nearly dropping the pitcher she was holding. "I'm not an experiment," I replied coolly. "And we're pretty busy right now, so—" "Just surprised is all," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. B always struck me as totally straight. Must be a phase. The cafe had grown quieter, nearby customers now openly listening to our exchange. "Derek," Beatrice finally spoke, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "You need to leave." "Come on, I'm a paying customer." He gestured to his coffee cup. "Just making conversation with your new roommate." The way he emphasized the last word made my skin crawl. "She asked you to leave," came a firm voice from behind him. One of our regulars, a silver-haired professor named Eleanor, had risen from her table. "You're disrupting the event." Derek looked around, suddenly aware that the entire coffee shop was watching him with disapproval. Several other customers had stood up as well, forming a subtle but unmistakable united front. "Whatever," he muttered, heading for the door. "Just looking out for an old friend. Some people take advantage." After the door closed behind him, Beatrice disappeared into the back room. I found her there a minute later, hands gripping the edge of the sink, breathing deliberately. "You okay?" I asked, touching her shoulder gently. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "I should have warned you he might show up. He came by last week when you were at the bar." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it didn't matter." She turned to face me. "He's the past. You're—" She hesitated. "I'm what?" I prompted softly. "Everything else," she finished. "The present, the future, everything that matters." We returned to the main room together, where the next poet was already performing. Eleanor caught my eye and gave a subtle thumbs up that made me smile despite the lingering tension. When the event ended and the last customers had finally departed, Beatrice locked the door and turned to me with determination in her eyes. "I have something to say," she announced. My heart skipped nervously. "That sounds serious." "It is." She took a deep breath. "I want to go up there, on poetry night, next week." Of all the things I expected, this wasn't one of them. "You want to read poetry?" "I've been writing, for weeks now." She looked almost shy. "Learning from you?" "Beatrice Smith, are you telling me you've been secretly composing verses behind my back?" She nodded, a blush creeping up her neck. "They're probably terrible." "I doubt that." I moved closer, curious now. "What are they about?" Her eyes met mine, a mixture of vulnerability and certainty in their blue depths, finding love when I least expected it, when it walked through my door soaking wet and asked for the cheapest coffee on the menu. My heart swelled as I pulled her into a kiss that said everything words couldn't. Derek's unwelcome appearance had only clarified what we both already knew. This was no experiment, no phase. This was real, and it was ours. 6 months passed like a dream. Winter gave way to spring, bringing with it a renewal that mirrored the transformation in my life. With Beatrice's encouragement, I'd compiled my best poems, many inspired by our unexpected romance, into a collection titled Shelter, Verses Found Between Storms. To my shock, a small publishing house expressed interest after hearing me read at a literary festival in Memphis. The advance wasn't large, but it was enough to make me feel like a real poet for the first time. The official release was scheduled for today. "You're pacing again," Beatrice observed from our bed, watching me wear a path into the carpet. We'd long since converted the spare room into a shared office space, my typewriter proudly displayed beside her accounting ledgers. What if nobody comes? The book launch party at the coffee shop was less than 3 hours away. What if they hate it? She rose and wrapped her arms around me from behind, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. "The pre-orders already exceeded the publisher's expectations. And does it really matter? You wrote this for yourself, not for reviews." "I wrote it for us," I corrected, turning to face her. "Most of it, anyway." Her smile, that same warm smile that had greeted me on that first rainy day, still had the power to steady my nerves. "And it's already perfect." The coffee shop had been transformed for the evening. Fairy lights hung from the ceiling, copies of my slender volume displayed prominently on a table decorated with spring flowers. A small podium stood at the front, microphone ready for readings. My hands trembled as I watched people file in. Not just the regular poetry crowd, but others too. Colleagues from the Velvet Room, where I still bartended 2 nights a week. Writers from Ross's Ranch, where Beatrice and I now took weekly lessons. Even Detective Mills, who had taken our statements after the robbery. "Standing room only," Beatrice whispered in my ear as she passed, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. "Told you." My publisher introduced me with generous praise before I took my place at the podium. Looking out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had become community, become friends, I felt a swell of gratitude so intense it momentarily robbed me of speech. "Thank you all for coming," I finally managed. A year ago, I was writing poems in the rain with nowhere to go. Today, my eyes found Beatrice at the back of the room. Today I have more than I ever dreamed possible. I read selections from throughout the book, charting the journey from desolation to belonging, from loneliness to love. When I reached the final poem, the one about finding home in a person rather than a place, I saw Beatrice discreetly wiping tears from her eyes. After the formal reading came the signing. As I inscribed copies with personal messages, Beatrice kept me supplied with water and encouragement. The line moved steadily until just one person remained. Ross from the ranch, clutching his copy awkwardly. "Never been much for poetry," he admitted gruffly. "But this is special. You two are special." His simple validation meant more than he could know. He had watched our relationship bloom during those weekend rides, had been quietly supportive when some other ranchers had raised eyebrows. As the last guests departed and we began cleaning up, Beatrice paused by the podium where I was gathering my notes. "I have something for you," she said, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. "To commemorate your first publication." Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a tiny book. When I opened it, microscopic engraving read Shelter on one side and B+ on the other. "It's beautiful," I whispered as she fastened it around my neck. "There's something else." She seemed suddenly nervous. "I've been thinking about the coffee shop name." "Beatrice's Beans? What about it?" "I was wondering how you'd feel about Beatrice and Kira's." She tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "Make it official. Business partners, life partners, whatever comes next." My heart swelled as I understood what she was offering, not just her business but her future, entwined permanently with mine. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "To all of it." Later that night, after we'd cleaned the shop and celebrated privately in our apartment, we lay tangled in sheets and whispered dreams. My fingers traced the line of her jaw, still marveling that this extraordinary woman had chosen me. "I dedicated the book to the woman who gave me shelter from the storm and taught me to ride," I said softly. "But that barely scratches the surface of what you've given me." "And what's that?" she asked, brushing her lips against my forehead. "Permission to be exactly who I am, to write honestly, to love completely." I pressed closer, breathing in her familiar scent, to stop running from what scares me and run toward what heals me instead. Her arms tightened around me as April moonlight spilled across our bed. Outside, Little Rock continued its nightly rhythm. But inside our small sanctuary, we had created something timeless. A love story neither of us had seen coming, written in coffee stains and poetry, in whispered promises and everyday courage. "Read me something?" she requested sleepily. I didn't need the book. The words lived in me now, permanent as breath, so I whispered verses about finding home in unexpected places, about rain that leads to rainbows, about a wandering poet and the woman brave enough to offer her not just shelter but love.